Welcome back. How was the Great White North? Very sunny. Just two things. Yeah. I'm sure there were a lot of answers. No kidding.
All right, everyone, let's get started with this week's edition of HotSci. So, I'm Wadekar, one of the organizers. Thank you very much for coming. And please pay attention. All right. So this week's focus is big data. We wanted to take the opportunity to highlight some of the work going on at Space Telescope that focuses more on AI and machine learning methods, as well as the use of survey science. So our first speaker today is Jay Wadekar, who is a postdoc here at Johns Hopkins. And I'll let him take it away, and we'll save our applause for the end. All right, thanks.
Okay, this is working. Okay. Hey everybody, thanks for giving me an opportunity to present some of this work here. So my talk will be about like combining principal methods with machine learning tools and why this is the best of both worlds. Sorry for the cheesy title, but I would say I want to like make a case why combination of these two things is better than these two things alone. So I'm a postdoc at JHU. I joined last fall. I'll be here until December this year. After that, I'm joining UT Austin as a faculty member. And this work is mostly done by some people at Johns Hopkins, like Mark Chung, Ben Wandelt, Emmanuel Liberty, and also like some people at the IIS or the IIS group gravitational wave search pipeline that I'm in. Okay, so this talk, a part of this talk was just to give an introduction to my research. Like as I'm a new person here, I would like to like talk to people here on. And I work on not just gravitational waves, but also like some other topics. So I thought of like just this is one quick slide to if you have some common overlap with me on these topics, like feel free to talk to me. I would be happy to talk to you. I also work on, other than gravitational waves, also work on machine learning for cosmology and hydrodynamic simulations. I've worked on like cluster mass estimation in the past. And then like also like galaxy survey cosmology. And I also worked on using like dwarf galaxy ISM to constrain dark matter. So in particular, I've been interested in like dwarf galaxies which are in the local group outside the virial radius. So the things which have gas in them, can you use them to constrain dark matter? Like dark matter will start heating the gas in these systems, and you can constrain those models of dark matter. So please feel free to talk to me if you are interested in these things too. But okay, my main talk is about like gravitational waves and machine learning. So why combine these two worlds of like the principal searches and machine learning? So I think, I mean, machine learning tools are optimal in the limit of infinite data and compute. But this idealistic situation is not often realized in practice, and quite rarely in some of our astronomy domains where we have limited data. And it's not enough to train like these very big models like transformers or like these very heavy CNNs. And the second point is like combining machine learning methods with principal match filtering tools can help build like ML models which are more robust with respect to like generalizability and interpretability. So these are the big problems in machine learning tools. Like you train them on one telescope data and then you want to use it on some other telescope data. It doesn't generalize well. But if you can combine them with some principal thing that you know, it can be trained with less data and also has more robust properties like generalizability, interpretability. So my talk is like threefold. I try to squeeze in three things in here. Feel free to like stop at any point and ask me any questions on these. So I'll be talking about like machine learning for first making optimal template banks. Then I'll talk about using machine learning for like especially non-Gaussian noise, the noise that we don't know how to analytically write down properly. And then the last is a bonus thing that I will present, like it's using like AI tools like large language models to help with like gravitational wave search code bases or in general code bases in astronomy. In the first part, before jumping into like where machine learning is useful in gravitational wave template banks, I thought of just giving you an overview of what the gravitational wave search looks like. So in the first step, what we do is you make a bank of templates, we call them. So you have like mass of, there are two black holes, so the total mass and the mass ratio. For each single point in this space, you have a gravitational wave waveform, which looks like the orange one here. And then you filter them through the strain data that is coming from the LIGO, Hanford, Livingston, Virgo detector data streams. When like for example here, this is the first gravitational wave event that we saw. The template looks a very good match. You get a good SNR, and then you catch this as a trigger. So this is the first step of the pipeline. You have the gravitational wave search in or data analysis in total consists of many steps. You collect triggers from one pipeline, look for coherent triggers in multiple detectors. You then, for each of these gold triggers, you perform parameter estimation where you estimate the mass and the spins of the black holes that form this, and then you estimate the populations of black holes in our universe, like how many black holes there should be at particular masses. And there's some interesting features here, like the peak at near 30 solar mass, but stuff like that. So in the first step is like making template banks, and this step is a bit tricky. Like you can see from in this figure itself, like it's not evenly spaced. You are not making just some rectangle and then filling them up with points. What is happening is actually at lower masses, there is more feature in the waveforms. Like there are more cycles in band, so you need to create more templates. And whereas at the high masses, the waveform is short, so you don't need to create as many templates. You can capture the features in the waveform with less number of points. And also there are interesting degeneracies. Like if you change the total mass and mass ratio in particular ways, you can get almost the same gravitational wave waveform. So you don't want to like duplicate these things in the template bank, because you're creating two templates for essentially the same waveform. That you don't want to do. So you want to reduce like redundancy in the banks and create like optimal template banks, so you don't have to pay this computational cost of like every template needs to be filtered with the data. So you want to keep the number of templates to be less. And what is like one of the techniques that is used for this is essentially principal component analysis. So you have your gravitational wave phase. You can decompose that into a few principal components, or what some people call it like singular value decomposition, SPD. You can do this decomposition, and then you can pick up some of the few coefficients in this and only create a template bank using those few coefficients. And the first one for this, maybe some people know, is the chirp mass. So this is like the invariant combinations of the two masses which has the maximum spread in the waveform. So you want to include like different waveforms with different chirp masses as the zeroth order effect in your template bank. And so you can get these things from PCA, which is this principal component analysis. And what we always prefer is like smaller template banks are more optimal as the computational cost is lower. So this essentially is boiling down to a dimensionality reduction problem. We want the shortest template bank possible in our case. And an introduction to PCA essentially is just like you are decomposing high dimensional data into a few important dimensions. So here is like some simple gene data in 3D. The situation gets more complicated in ND, but then these tools like PCA save you because they can find which dimensions, which 2 or 3 dimensions in the data have the most spread. And then when you look at that, you can identify like different substructures in the data, for example. So it's essentially you're taking a Cartesian grid and you're rotating it so that the x-axis is along the maximum spread in the data, y-axis is along the second maximum spread direction, and then so on. Okay, so then a trick, not a trick question. A question is, if you have a data set like this, and I I want to now find like, okay, how many, can I compress this down into into like less number of dimensions. So I pass this data set to PCA. How many dimensions do you think PCA will return? Yeah, 2. It will just return these 2 dimensions because like there is no, if I just rotate like 2 dimensions, there is no way I can fit this with 1 dimension. So you have to kind of have 2 dimensions, and that's actually a limitation of these traditional tools like these linear tools like PCA or SPD. As you can see, the data is not 2-dimensional; it's just 1-dimensional. All I need to describe this data is a parameter which is along theta. I can ignore the spread along the radial direction, but like this data set is just 1-dimensional, and so all I need to capture this is like the value of theta for each point. So the previous tools are not ideal for cases like this when there is like non-linearity present. And actually this is the case in our gravitational wave search, and we realized that later. So there were previous studies using this PCA method on gravitational wave waveforms, and you can see this is the 3 PCA components that they got. So you have like this, yeah, these are the first 3 things, and you can see that the templates are not situated like uniformly in this space, but there is a structure here. So this means that like these 3 dimensions, out of these 3, one of them is redundant. This is only a 2-dimensional space, which I'm like not properly capturing using this PCA. So here is where like we can use machine learning tools. So machine learning tools, the one good thing they have is like they can work non-linearly. Like you're not constrained to the linearity assumption, and they work in high dimensions. So here a simple quick fix for this we realized was that like what you do is like you only take the C0, C1, the first 2 dimensions, and then you predict the rest of the dimensions using the random forest or any other machine learning algorithm. So here basically you can see the 3rd dimension is essentially predicted if you know the first 2 dimensions. So this is how one can reduce like dimensionality. And I think like in Astro we use these tools like SVD or PCA in many different cases. We want to boil down like complex data sets like flux values for different bands or something, and then you want to reduce them to like a few dimensions. This I think is quite ubiquitously used, this PCA or SVD like tools, but you can do a quick check, and if you use these things you can do a quick check whether you can predict some dimensions from the rest, and then you can see that there is a redundancy in the data. So these machine learning tools are very quick to use. This is just like 2-line thing that you can write down with scikit-learn. So I mean, if you use like these linear tools, maybe you might find this useful. Other way, what you can do is also use like deep neural net. So I have my PCA dimensions. What I try to do is like I try to compress all these 10 feature data or whatever feature data into like just two features, and then if I can recover the same data set that I input, it means that 2 dimensions were sufficient. And this is how like neural nets can also do the dimensionality reduction. Okay, so so that was my first part. So the second part is like using machine learning for reducing non-Gaussian noise. And okay, to give, I mean, I don't know if people have looked at some gravitational wave plots, but what we do is like when we get signals, we typically make these plots, we call them spectrograms. So these are like time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis. And this is like our favorite event, the 1708-17, where we saw a gravitational wave and also the electromagnetic counterparts by all telescopes, including people here. Yeah, you can see that this is a nice chirp, but then when you go to high masses, actually you only see like the merger end because like the waveform goes to lower and lower frequencies, and below 20 hertz we are not sensitive. So there is an inspiral here, but you cannot see. So you only see the end part, the merger part of the signal. And so then, I mean, this signal is hard to replicate in noise. Like noise will find it very hard to mimic this, but this noise can mimic. Like for example, these are just noise that we saw in the detectors. Like you can see things like we call them glitches in the detector. They can occur for many different reasons, like ravens pecking on the detector, stuff like that. We don't know, but yeah, from a data analyst point of view, this is like they wreak havoc in the high mass detections, because these things can look almost like these high mass mergers. So we want to kind of reduce this, and why this is an important problem is that these high mass systems are very interesting from a phenomenological point of view. So you have like massive stars, they can form black holes up to a certain point. Like you can have say like less than 130 solar mass stars which can form like black holes up to 50 solar masses. But then there is an intermediate regime where you don't form black holes from stellar collapse alone. This thing is called pair-instability mass gap, where you have an explosion which entirely disrupts the full star. There's no like remnant left behind. So this is an interesting theoretical regime, like theoretical predicted regime, which we want to test with data. So, and these are more like high mass black holes. So they are in the glitch-like part of the space. And so we want to, push for these things, and also we want to push for the very heavy ones, the IMBH we call them. That's another thing where we have been interested in for like many decades. These IMBH like things. So okay, how can like machine learning tools be helpful in this case? So we already have like template banks and we filter the data, but the template banks do a very good analysis in a region which is local to the signal. So for example, 10 milliseconds to plus minus 10 milliseconds, you can see that the template is filtering this data, and then at t equal to 0, it finds a nice peak. So this looks like a robust signal from the pipeline point of view. But then if you look like very far away, in this you can see like there are these similar disturbances occurring, and then if you take into account this information, this seems like this is just a noise transient, because this has been appearing many times nearby. So it cannot be gravitational waves, because gravitational waves you don't expect to occur in short durations or clustered in time. And this information was not being used in our pipeline. And it's a challenging problem, like what information do you use? So if you have a trigger which is SNR 10, if you have something nearby which is SNR 12, which is like say 8 seconds away, and then something SNR 15 like 10 seconds away, how do I use this extra information to assign some probability that this is real or not? That's a tricky question. We don't know how to write down this likelihood analytically. So machine learning can come in, because you don't have to write down the likelihood for this. You just show examples of this occurring in the data, and the machine will learn what likelihood to write. So again, playing some simple game, like so there is a trigger at t equal to 0 in all of these cases. Which left or right do people think that it's a real trigger versus a noise transient? So how many people think like right things are real triggers? Okay, quite a few, and that is right. Like on the right, there are real triggers, and then what we can see immediately is that there is like a lot of junk near your these trigger, and which makes it a spurious thing. And the pipeline was the search pipelines are not using this information that there is junk away from our trigger, and so we could use like machine learning to put this information into our pipeline. So now we can better classify which things are real and which things are not. So you have this very complicated function that you want to estimate, which is like if is the trigger some noise transient, which we call glitch, as a function of separation from nearby triggers or glitches, the signal to noise ratio of nearby triggers, the separation from some excised regions, or the power spectral density of the strain. So it's a complicated, the point is just that it's a complicated function. I don't know how to write it down, but I have examples. And so this can help me actually use this extra information to say whether this probability of what I'm seeing is a real thing or not. And then you can see in this case, like the pipeline can identify almost like half of the triggers to be the noise transients rather than the real things. And this actually helps us increase the volume time. So if a detector is on, like these plots mean that if a detector is on for 1 year, this is the gigaparsec cube volume that I'm seeing with the detector. This Q is the mass ratio of the binary, equal mass, 1:2 mass binaries. And so this lower plot is the money plot. Like you can see that once you include this machine learning information, which is the VT new, you can get that you gain in sensitivity by about like some 10% to like some 18% across a range of masses. So essentially you're doing like better data analysis, and you are increasing sensitivity with the same data. And then this actually can enable you to find like more gravitational waves in this high mass regime, because you see the sensitivity is now increased. So in this plot, like I'm showing when we ran our pipeline, we found like some new candidates. So like I should mention, like we have an independent search pipeline to the LIGO-Virgo collaboration. So the collaboration also runs like the search pipeline. They find new events or events in each data stream, which I've shown in gray. But then when we ran our pipeline, we found some additional things which are shown in these colored contours, and the color represents the probability of these things to be of astrophysical origin as compared to noise. So you can see that we find like a bit more things in the high mass regime, and actually this number increased when we added this ML component to the pipeline. We already had a few interesting new things, but once you add machine learning, this number increased, especially in this high mass range. So this will be important for like the phenomenology that I was mentioning about for the IMBH or the pair instability mass gap case. Okay, I think I'm going quite fast. So okay. So the third part is a bit bonus, but like feel free to ask me questions. This is like something I'm tinkering with, and some part of this I've also been talking to John Wu here, and also like Dan Ko, who runs like these Monday meetings for discussing like applications of machine learning or these applications of specifically large language models to our science. And okay, the context for this work was that now, I mean, there are many subfields in Astro, and then each of these subfield we have quite heavy like code bases that we use. So in this particular example of gravitational wave data analysis, like we have a search pipeline, and it's almost like 50,000 lines of code by now. There is another library which is used in the gravitational wave data analysis called LalSuit. So this is like a community grown library, and that has almost like 3 million lines of code. And so for a new person, if you want to jump into this area, I mean, it's a steep barrier to get into. If you want to like, you have a gravitational wave waveform from say some exotic compact object, and you want to look into the data. I mean, you have to integrate your thing into one of these search pipelines, and that's quite hard. And this is becoming harder and harder as things are getting more sophisticated. So yeah, it's a barrier for people not in the sub community. And this also happens for, like for me, if I want to like do some analysis with like HST data in some very particular narrow range, I have to learn like this specific code base, which would be quite hard. And especially like, okay, I'm a non-standard particle physics, like this one example where I have some exotic model that I want to try to look into, and it's not easy to do this. So yeah, can we use like some of these LLM or large language models that now the community is developing for this case? So this is just a plot to show one of the one particular score which they have is like, you have like these public repositories and they have like open bugs. So can a language model like fix these open bugs by itself? This is like one of the scores that they put in, and this is the date. And I should just mention that this date, I mean, in Astro, we are like used to like, okay, things changing on orders of years or decades, but like you can look at this is like not year, like month by month, they're like improving quite a bit. And they were here like around like, they could solve like 4% of the bugs to now it's like 50% and going up. So this is like one of the places where they are actually producing a big revolution, I think, in this particular like coding type use cases. And so can we use like something off the shelf that is available? So for example, like these language models have been trained on nearly all the public like text or code bases on the internet. But then once you train them, like the LLM is not big enough to memorize all parts of that big data set that they have trained on. So they only retain like general level info, like what are like high level things, like high level algorithms that I need to know, or some high level information that is applicable in many different places. So they only retain the high level information. They don't retain specific knowledge. And one example is this is like, okay, if I ask it like how exactly are the template banks constructed in the IIS pipeline? This is a very specific question. There's like only 2 or 3 GitHub pages available on the internet. There's no motivation for this machine learning model to learn this. But then this is an important question to like people like us or me who work on this pipeline, or people who want to use this specific pipeline. So in a high level overview, what one can do is actually you have a pre-trained machine learning model. You don't have to retrain it. What happens is like you give it an extra data set that you have. So this can be Astro related things, like you can have your own code bases, your papers, your PDFs. something specific to your work, and these can be private also if you prefer. And what it does is, like, when you ask a question, typically this language model only looks at your question and gives you an answer. But in this specific case, what happens is, like, you can actually retrieve some of this information and then use this as an additional context along with your question, and then produce the final answer. So it's like it has a cheat sheet of things, let's say, or it can like recover the proper cheat sheet in a very nice way. So when you ask a question, first it searches for, like, it looks at like which of these database entries is the most relevant for this, and then it uses that to answer the question. So this can then answer our specific astro or whatever my specific question I have related to some specific thing I work on. Okay. And then just like a simple difference with fine tuning is that I'm not retraining the model. I'm only using I'm using the same model. And I can give like big data sets to it. So okay, instead of like just showing you the slides, I think I have a model which I can show you actually. So this is like one of the things. So we have a GitHub, like a simple GitHub page where we have a pipeline which has like different Python codes. Like you can see all these .py codes. So what you can do is, like, actually, I mean, this is something we are experimenting. There are many different people also trying to do this similar thing. So this now search bot has like all the information that is put in my particular our pipeline that I showed you on GitHub. So you can ask it now questions like this. How are template banks like constructed? So for example, like this is a simple question you can start with. So yeah, I don't know this code base, but then how should I make start making a template bank? So it is like procuring like snippets from the code which are relevant to you, and then yeah, saying that yeah, this can set up the template bank if you need, and here is the reference that it provides. So I also can see whether this is hallucinating, or I can check this myself because it's showing me which code in the GitHub repository that it used to make this answer. So I think it can be important, and I think you can build it basically with like I was just, I mean, this is like open to use. Actually, most of this code I did not even write. Like now these models are so good at coding. It's like there's a feedback loop now that these machine learning models are very good at coding machine learning modules. So it's like a loop which I don't know where it will go to soon. But okay, like here I just, what I did was just provide URLs to my GitHub repository. So you can see the .python codes are here. And then yeah, this chatbot just uses that in his case, and yeah, and then you can ask it like different questions of whatever you want in the pipeline. So I think, I mean, people can, if they're interested, like just fork this repository and use it. I mean, it's all open source. If it is useful for your own case, and I mean, one of the use cases I think could be like if there is a new student, for example, like who wants to work on this pipeline, this can be a good thing for them to, in the beginning, like try to understand what these different like structure of the pipeline is, or can help identify like what is the physical intuition behind some things that are done in the pipeline, stuff like that. So yeah, if people are interested, like here is the QR code, and here is a link that I have. You can copy this for your own thing very easily. As I showed you, is just the URLs that you need to tweak, and you can do your own thing. And what we want to do is Python codes, like Jupyter notebooks for running the codes, and also some of the archive papers like we have published. You can put all that in, and then it can use all this information maybe. And yeah. So that's kind of the high-level overview. Okay, and then this is my summary. Like I told you, I mean, machine learning methods are optimal in the infinite data and compute limit. We are typically not in that limit, so I think it's good for these machine learning models if we can scaffold them onto techniques that we know and understand, so they can learn the residuals from what we know and understand, rather than learning the full thing by themselves. Because that's cheaper for them to train them, and also they are more robust that way, I think. So I showed you like combining, there were different, like two different ways where we could combine machine learning searches, where we used it for constructing optimal template banks. We reduce this redundancy of like these linear tools like singular vector decomposition or principal component analysis, and also reduce non-Gaussian noise in the pipeline, which helps us now identify some of these very high mass black hole mergers. And the last part was more the fun part, where you can use it to increase accessibility to code bases. And then maybe we can, there are other things in gravitational waves. Actually, there's a big code base written in C language. So that's like one of the places where maybe if this is used, it will make it easier, because like now among the young people, we don't know C, and there's a big code base like this. So you can use these things to increase accessibility to Fortran or C things also. Okay, I think stop there.
All right, let's thank Jay. Time for a couple of questions.
Thank you, Jay. This is not my field, so I actually have a question on this figure that you also showed back in slide 24. What's the difference between the little points and the big points? So are the little points the ones that are like precisely detected?
Yes, so this is the parameter estimation errors of the things that you have detected. So some of them are more precisely detected than some other things. So for high mass, what happens is like there are only a few cycles in band, so it's hard to estimate what the mass and the redshift of these things are. So these are just estimating the uncertainties on those things.
So basically, does that mean that some new things that you're detecting are at a very high precision in mass inversion, while some others are not, right?
Yeah. So here actually, sorry, yeah.
Well, I was just wondering, how can you detect some things that have not been detected before with that level of precision that gives you the loop?
Right. So here actually, I mean, the loop actually depends on the signal to noise ratio. But then what happens is like for candidates like these, there are a lot of like these noise transients which also give you a lot of high signal to noise ratio things. So then you cannot differentiate this thing versus the other noise transient. So the previous pipelines like threw it out. But now we have a better method of estimating whether this is real or not. So the signal to noise ratio stops mattering after a while for significance. That's like, I mean, what you're raising is a very important point. Like even though this is like super significant, I mean, in terms of signal to noise ratio in this regime, we have also seen there are like say 100 other things with similarly high signal to noise ratio. So we cannot confidently say whether this is real or not. That is the reason actually. But for low masses, it's not. Like low masses, if you have a high signal to noise ratio, you are real. Like there's no ambiguity, because the loud noise transients can never mimic you at that high signal to noise ratio case.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have one more question.
How does the AI method compare to like looking at auxiliary channels, or are you using it for training?
Yeah, actually, so we have not used it yet, but that is like the next thing we want to do. So right now we are only using, like, say you have a trigger, how many triggers are next to you. That's we are not using anything from the auxiliary dataset, but it could very well be used in our pipeline, very easily be added along with the things that we have used. So that's our next step. Actually, we are looking into it. The good question actually. Yeah.
If you have more questions for Jay, please ask them during Sphere. But yeah.
Do you hear me now on the lapel? Okay. All right, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak about the work that, well, none of this work did I do, actually. 100% of everything I'm going to show you today was done by a number of different postdocs and tech staff who are in the auditorium here, and a number of people beyond. So if you've got any nasty questions, I encourage you to ask them at beer. I am just your humble narrator. So this is a very large project. So we have a large team of, this is only a small fraction of the actual guilty parties. And our project is to build a pixels to cosmology pipeline to do the cosmology experiment, one of the cosmology experiments with Roman, specifically to look at type 1a supernovae and how they may affect how they can be used to trace the dark energy content in the universe. We have 4 co-PIs, all of whom were either at STScI or JHU at some point. So if you've been here for a while, you certainly know some combination of Rebecca Hounsel, Ben Rose, Dave Rubin, and Dan Skolnick. I have put little bubbles here around the STScI or JHU folks. Hopefully you know all of these people. I'm not going to name all of them, but there's a couple others who've had big impacts on this project, such as Sebastian Gomez, who was one of the Institute Fellows here before moving on to UT Austin. So again, ask these people the nasty questions. So I'm going to leave this slide up here and just let you read it while I talk. So Roman, as many people may or may not know, is the next great observatory that we're going to launch here in the very near future. Roman's got a multi-mandate. So it's going to survey the galactic bulge to look for sort of free-floating planets through microlensing events, but also conduct 2 large wide area surveys to look for different cosmological probes. Specifically, the High Latitude Wide Area Survey, which will have an imaging and spectroscopic component. That's largely to do things like baryon acoustic oscillations, redshift space distortions. But we'll also have a high latitude time domain survey, which will be a couple of fields, high time cadencing to look for transients. And so I'm going to talk to you today exclusively about the transients. And so that's the mandate that the Roman mission has. But my team, or the team of which we are a part of, is this bottom mandate. So we are responsible to build a pipeline to not just do the experiment ourselves, but as you may know, the Roman is a completely public observation or observatory. And so our pipeline is meant to facilitate anyone to come along and grab these same data and do these same measurements. So all of our work is really sort of foundational, which is why they call us an infrastructure team. So I want to show this slide because I've been saying around a lot, we are, if you think back to where you were in this auditorium, circa 2019, all the energy that was abuzz about JWST. Right. Well, we are at that same sort of delta with respect to launch for Roman. And so I'm really trying to generate that same kind of fervor around what you're going to have with Roman. And so this is a slide that I think every Roman apparatchik shows that sort of highlights the similarities and the mirrors between Hubble and Roman, and of course buttress it against Webb along with the wavelength range. And while those 2 things are not really sort of noteworthy, the mirror size of the wavelength range, it really is the field of view. So what you're seeing here in 3D color is the FAT survey of the Andromeda with the NIRCam field of view here for Webb. Let's see, does the cursor work? Sorry, no cursor. The Webb field of view at the bottom from NIRCam, and then the Hubble field of view superposed with the Roman observations. So, it's ostensibly a factor of sort of 100 larger in area, but that's kind of misleading because these other observatories were sort of built to be point and shoot type of facilities. So there's a lot of overhead in slewing. Anyone who's set up a JWST observation knows the kind of overheads that I'm talking about. Whereas Roman is built to be the exact opposite. Roman is built to be a surveyor. And so it's not just that it's, a comparable mirror to Roman or to Hubble. Not just that it's 100 times larger field of view, but it's also much, much faster in doing big surveys. And so you could do something like FAT, as you're seeing here, which was a heroic effort by the FAT team. But now imagine doing this in sort of 1, maybe 2 pointings with Roman. Right? You can really bang that out in pretty short order. And so that's the Roman spiel that, hopefully people are starting to get excited about what you can do for Roman from this. So now I'm going to transition to talking about the work that the STScI and JHU researchers have really been doing. Again, we're going to be focusing on the High Latitude Time Domain Survey, the HLTDS. So I just want to call your attention to that. So you can see it's 2 fields, one in the north, one in the south. As it happens, the one in the south overlaps with one of the LSST deep drilling fields. The fields were chosen to have, relatively low or as low as possible foreground extinction from the Milky Way, but also necessarily to be in the Roman CDZ. And that's so we can come back with that high time cadence of every 5 days to look for these things. In each field, there's going to be a wide and a deep component. The deep component will, of course, be a subset of the wide, with the total wide area covering about 18 square degrees through the filters R, Z, Y, J, H. So those are very, very similar to the filters that you probably know and love on ACS and WIFC3. In the deep, which will again be sort of a wedding cake thing, which will be the center of the deep fields, or sorry, so the center of the wide fields, we'll also add an F band. The F band is not something that's really common in the HST world, and it's sort of kind of like a K short-ish. It combines certain aspects of H, certain aspects of K, so it gets you a little bit redder. As it happens, Roman also has a K band, but the sensitivity of that is pretty low. So F is usually the reddest band that we'll be talking about. And if you see me here and you hear me talking, you probably know that I'm going to start talking about spectroscopy at some point. We have a significant buy-in from Subaru. So in the north, we plan to do a lot of the spectroscopy using very likely some Subaru facilities like the Prime Focus and Spectrograph. But in the south, there isn't equivalent contributions from the community. So all of the spectroscopy that I'm going to be talking about later today will be happening only in the southern field. And again, that's because we plan to bootstrap off the contributions from our collaborators. I should also mention that Roman, like all the other observatories, is going to have commissioning and all that kind of stuff. But the high latitude time domain survey will happen sort of in the middle of the notional time frame. So something like year 3 following whenever launch actually happens. So we're talking about supernovae. We're talking about high latitude time domain survey. So how many supernovae do we expect to get? This is the big data session. And I kind of, when I heard that, I was, on one hand, I see where it's big data, but as you're going to see, we're going to really distill that big data down into but just a handful of sources in the end of the day. So it really becomes more of a manageable data set, actually. So Ben just put out a paper with a number of us on the team predicting based on what the notional survey will be. I should mention that the notional survey was established by a core community science team that was instituted by NASA to review both what the mandate is and what the community might want out of these massive fields and come together with a coherent observation plan. And so Ben took that plan, coupled with ideas about what the sources are, like their spectral energy distributions, whatever their volume space densities are, the luminosities and things like that, with the observational setup, how much field of view, what sensitivity, what time cadence, to then predict how many different types of transient events this survey is going to capture. And so you could probably give an entire colloquium about every one of these rows of this table, but I'm just going to focus in on the type 1As for today because that's, again, the primary mandate of the mission. So Ben estimated there'd be about 22,000 1As. But when you then slice out the fact that we're only going to be having prism spectroscopy of about 20% of this total sample, we're really going to be talking about sort of 4,000 1As in the field, right? But a number of those will still be too faint to observe, given the observational setup. So, we're really expecting something more like a few thousand, 1,000 to 2,000 viable 1As for this whole program. And so there's a QR code to Ben's paper if you want to know more about any one of these individual source classifications. So the thing I want you to take home from this slide is that in sum total, Roman's going to determine or find about 64,000 transients in the high latitude time domain survey. Those 64,000 transients will have about 11 million photometric measurements in the broadbands that I mentioned. And given the smaller area, we'll have about 500,000 spectroscopic observations. So a 1D spectrum, or about 500,000 1D spectra for all of these transients. And so me and the cohort of tech staffs and postdocs and graduate students here at JHU will be responsible for making these 500,000 measurements. The whole team is, again, it's a pixels to cosmology framework. So this slide is here just to impress you about how organized we are. And so We've got different working groups for different things. I am in charge of the slitless spectroscopy, so I will be the pipeline lead for all of that. And you can see that this work is embedded in a number of different spots, both high up in the data flow chain, to like how we pre-process the data, all the way down to things like how we actually then characterize the SCDs once we have them. Determining, in fact, is it a 1A, is it a core collapse? If it's a 1A, what additional processing we might need to do to determine the absolute magnitudes. But again, if you see me up here talking, you know I'm going to talk about the slitless spectroscopy. So I'll just say a few words. Roman, unfortunately, no longer has a dedicated spectrograph. That was removed a number of years ago as a cost-cutting measure. And so as a sort of consolation prize, we had an extra grating installed. And so we'll be talking about that extra grating, which is a low-resolution prism. The prism, you probably hear everyone here talking about grisms most of the time. The primary difference between a prism and a grism, well, there's really two that you should take away. Prisms are often very nonlinear, so how the wavelength increases as you move along the spectral trace often has a very nonlinear shape to it, and so that's usually a source of a lot of extra work. But what you gain from that is you also don't have higher order spectral traces. So therefore, a prism is usually more sensitive than a grism. And so we will be using the grism to take advantage of those two things. So the upside, the good, bad, and the ugly of this is that we get a spectrum for every source. So we're not required to pick apertures, put down slits, open up different micro shutters. We get something for everything. But that's also its weakness. That means we have lots of contamination to deal with. And what do you do when two different spectral traces overlap? And so the really bad problem for us is that we're going to be looking for the supernovae, which are often associated with host galaxies. And so we have this sort of extreme case of the contamination, or what we'll call, say, self-contamination, the contamination from the host that the supernova resides in. And so everything I'm going to talk about now is really our techniques that we've been developing here at the Institute for mitigating this self-contamination. But before talking about that, I'll just say a few quick words about basic contamination to frame the problem. If we consider here in yellow at the bottom, that's maybe the standard scene, or the direct image scene. That's what you would get if you just looked through any old telescope. And if we imagine observing it at 3 different roll angles on the sky, that's shown here in blue, red, and green. And the detector, like any good detector, disperses to the right. Ours is not a good detector. Disperses to the right, and you can see under some of those orients, particularly in the red one, I can highlight a region there where you'll see 2 of the spectral traces overlap. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. What do you do in the case the 2 spectral traces overlap? But if you know me, you know I've been working on this problem for a long time, and then there was a really exciting paper that Tree just published earlier this year in AppJ, we're asking the question, well, what happens when we take the limit that the displacement between any of the 2 sources actually goes to, say, 0? And then you're really not thinking about what I drew in the cartoon in the previous slide as a bunch of isolated point sources, but really as sort of some extended source profile. And so this graphic, courtesy of Tree, which is in his paper, and I encourage you all to go look at that paper. Is it on archive now, Tree? Not yet. OK, I didn't put a QR code because I couldn't find it. Yeah, and so this is showing sort of more the way that we're trying to think about the extended case problem. And if you imagine what you've got is you've really got sort of coming into the telescope, you've really got this 3-dimensional beast coming in. You've got something that describes the x and y coordinates, or Arian-Dec, or whatever. I don't know these Greek letters, but these Greek letters that describe the spatial profile of the object by a 3rd dimension wavelength on how that's going to describe the SCD. And we really have an SCD sort of per pixel or per subregion within the galaxy. And with this sort of framework, you can take this data cube and slice it and dice it and add it and mangle it however you like to, say, render out, say, a 2D prism image, as he's showing here on the upper left. Or you can render it out into, say, a direct image to see what you would get if you just looked through your telescope in the normal sense. And so we're going to try to build code that takes these data at a bunch of different orients to try to infer this underlying 3D flux cube. And that's the goal. That's the name of the game. So how do we do that? We do it with a technique that I've been pushing for a while now called linear reconstruction. And so how that works is Here I'm showing, again, a very idealized case of a red source and a blue source. The color, again, is here just to guide your eye. It doesn't indicate the SEDs of the sources. But it's so that I can say, ascribe a wavelength axis in red that belongs to the red source, and a wavelength axis that belongs to the blue in the blue source. And then I can zoom in on some pixel in that overlap region and realize that the flux in that pixel, the flux in pixel I, X, Y, is really just going to be some weighted sum of the spectrum of the blue source time plus the spectrum of the red source weighted by some factors. And so if you stare at that equation long enough, you realize that's just a standard linear equation, and we can build standard matrix techniques to sort of describe the equivalent equation, but for every pixel for which there is signal here. And when we do that, we build that big linear system, we could just, in theory, just compute the inverse, or maybe the Penrose inverse or something fancy, to find the solution. But as it happens, that linear operator is highly ill-conditioned. So slight perturbations in the data will lead to massive changes in the inferred spectrum. So we do a standard technique which is sometimes called damped least squares, which is given here in this equation that I like to call psi squared. So the first term is what you consider the classic chi-square. The second term is a regularization term that is meant to keep wild oscillations well behaved. And so then the question is, how do we determine this optimal damping parameter L, script L? How do you find the right number here that gives equal power to these two terms? So this is now showing the work of Massimo Grigio, who's implemented all of these ideas into a coherent pipeline that I hope you will find impressive. So we start with, imagine we modeled some subset of Sloan galaxies to determine the SED per pixel of some sample of basically redshift 0 galaxies to determine the flux cube. Then Tree and Massimo take that flux cube, project it forward to make what would be simulated Roman images. And here I'm just showing 3, but we actually have about 30 of these. And then we select one of them as sort of the test case. So we build the big linear model, calibrate it on the second column, evaluate it for the third column, and the top is the simulated data, the bottom is the modeled, and then compute the residuals at the end that you would normally see. And so now you can see what I was talking about with this regularization term. So the 3 residuals are for the difference between this third column for different choices of damping parameter, and that's shown here at the bottom for script L. And so obviously, if the damping parameter is too negative, in this case, log of damping is -4, you get a lot of residuals, and that's bad. And the other A, if you make it too large, then you get also lots of really wacky structure. That's also bad. So we're trying to find that sweet spot in the middle where the residuals look pretty good. And so there's been a number of techniques on how to solve this problem. I put forth one solution. It was later revised by Neveu et al. And Trees considered yet a third option. And so here is building off of Trees' ideas, where we're looking at, say, something that describes the autocorrelation of the noise in that image. And this is very preliminary, but you can see that we picked out by our eye that log L of -3.1 sort of worked the best. And don't worry too much about what these axes are, other than the fact that all of the different realizations of the data are all sort of wanting to find something that's about the same, although these are maybe showing more like -2.8 or something like that. But they're all sort of coming in around the same value. They're not finding things like -4 or -2. But how does it look in practice, or a more practical example? So here on the far left, this is, say, what you might consider, say, the early time. So really early on, well before any supernova goes off. And then if you imagine some supernova going off, and we go back and we observe the field, here we rendered it at the same position angle, but that's just because of how we did it. And then now there's a supernova. And I assume everyone can look at these two images and see the obvious supernova that's there. And so given that you can see it, you might ask why we're doing any of this at all, and I guess I should just go home. But I find it kind of challenging to just immediately circle the supernova spectrum in the second column. So Massimo and Tree do their thing. They find this thing here in the middle. And so I'll just show like a blink so that you can see what kind of signal is actually being subtracted and where the data is. The fourth column, this was Massimo's idea, and I think this is a great one, because you might ask, well, this linear reconstruction thing is probably going to have some systematic noise of its own that we're introducing. So the question then was, well, how does it change if we take that very same supernova and we embed it in some other part of the image where we know a priori there isn't a host galaxy? And so what you really want to be comparing is, say, this middle column to the far right column, and you see that we're not actually producing a whole lot more noise. And so Massimo is in the process of characterizing what sort of limiting behavior these algorithms have based on the reconstruction. So I'll just say a few additional remarks, because the first question that I get asked every time I talk about this work is, this sounds like it's computationally intractable. How slow is it? It's actually really fast. So we're assuming that we're modeling about 1,700 pixels in the direct image. We're assuming we have 30 images coming in. We have a wavelength-dependent PSF that subtends about 9 by 9 pixels in the direct image. The linear operator that describes this problem is only about 12 gigabytes in size, but the matrix itself has a huge dimensionality. I'm not going to try to read those numbers to you, but hopefully you can see it's something like 10 to the 13 total elements in the matrix. But as it happens, most of them are 0. Identically 0, so we can leverage the fact that it's a very sparse matrix to solve this in something like less than the Hubble time. By assuming 20 different regularization parameters on fully parallelized Modison workstation, Massimo's techniques take about 50 minutes to do this full reconstruction. So I want this to sink in. I really want you to be impressed by this, because what he's effectively implemented here is an IFU-like data set from pure slitless spectroscopy, and something that's only like an hour to run per object. Now, it is rather low spectral resolution. It's R of like 100 or so. So, don't throw out your MIRI proposals just yet. But you can see where there might be a lot of advantage to scaling this up to bigger compute systems, more data, higher resolution spectrographs, and things like that. An interesting byproduct of this is we get that 3D flux cube out. And we can render that 3D flux cube out for different ways to do different evaluations of it. And so that's what's animating here in the bottom. And so I want to be clear, this is the deconvolved flux cube. So we would need to take this flux cube, convolve it with the wavelength-dependent PSF, and then combine it in a way that is weighted by the by the filter response curve to render an image. And that's what you're seeing here on the right, is a rendered wideband image. After we do all this work, we send this work off over to another postdoc here, James Dercasey, who is then implementing the pipeline to turn these cleaned 2D spectral images into 1D spectra that you all know and love. At present, we're building the Horn algorithm. At present, we're working with analytic profiles, but James is in the process of integrating the EPSF philosophy that Jay and others have done for high precision astrometry. So stay tuned for that. I expect we're going to have some really exciting results on this. I like to say that in Roman, all Roman roads lead to photometric redshifts. And so this is a very complex flow chart from Bhavin Joshi showing you how, despite all of this spectroscopic data, we are still reliant on photoz's. And so Bhavin has a paper that's hopefully going to come out soon, showing different predictions for the high latitude time domain survey. So the far right column is input redshift as a function of output redshift for what is the notional high latitude time domain survey. And we're supposed to be looking mostly at redshift 1. And at redshift 1, I don't think I need to convince you that there's some very serious pathologies here, particularly the cloud at the very highest photometric redshifts. And so that's obviously bad for supernova cosmology. So I asked Bhavin to go back and say, okay, well, now imagine we coupled Roman to Rubin, and we had the optical plus infrared photometry from, say, in the deep fields in the south. And you get a significantly better behavior of the output redshift behavior. However, you still see these weird structures, and I think this is due to the discretization of the SED library on the input. But clearly, things are starting to look a little better. And so in setting up for the high latitude time domain survey, we asked, well, could we do even better still by including an optical band from Roman? And so all that's different between the middle column and the last column is we now basically add an R band. There's also a K band in there, but with respect to the first column, but the big difference here is the R band is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So we were able to steer, Bhavin was able to steer the formulation of the high latitude time domain survey by adding the R band here just for the photo Z work. Bhavin is also leading the photometric redshift working group for Roman that meets on the first Tuesday of every month at 4 p.m. So if that interests you, there's his email address. take a picture, write it down, call me afterwards, email Bhavin, and come to that. They're public, everything's public. Please come and give Bhavin your thoughts on PhotoZs. I will say that our team is doing more than just building a pipeline. We're also calibrating with the ThermalVac data. So Stefano encouraged me to cut this slide if we run out of time. So I will just leave it to say that James is doing some outstanding work determining the wavelength solution. So I mentioned before that the prisms usually have a nonlinear wavelength response, and that's what you're seeing here on the far left plot. James is basically steering IPAC or advising IPAC on different ways that we are calibrating these types of relationships. Stefano's leading a calibration working group measurement on understanding how the photometric 0 points of the broadband observations vary as a function of position within the detector due to the angle of incidence of the photons, which we could talk a lot more about, but I think we're going to be out of time. So I'll stop here. Let you know that all of the code, all of the data products, everything you've seen me talk about is in some capacity either currently on GitHub or will be on GitHub come launch. There's the QR code to our GitHub page. And I want to give a big shout out to James, who will be speaking in the next HotSci session, which is in 2 weeks, on his primary research, which is on the physics of type 1a supernovae explosions. So if that interests you, come out and hear James' work on JWST. I'll stop there.
And we have time for any questions.
Sorry, Russ.
No.
Given the signal to noise you expect in Raman data, how well do you think the prism had to be calibrated in terms
The GRISM or the PRISM, to be clear.
whatever, your spectrograph? How well does it have to be calibrated on the scale of pixel in order for the method not to be dominated by signal to noise?
So I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know from the other direction that there are requirements that they be calibrated to something better than 1/10 of a pixel for the supernova experiment. So we are assuming that that is doable. As it happens, that is not the responsibility of our team or anyone here at ST. That's an IPAC problem. But that's the number that we're going with, is something like 1/10 of a pixel.
Okay,
And what damage that might do to this 3D reconstruction, that is on the to-do list for Massimo. Chris?
So yeah, all this very clever reconstruction stuff. How applicable is that out of the box to some other instrument, like say Euclid? Like, is it generalizable? Can it be generalizable?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is it requires a little bit of work. It mostly comes down to how you define the trace and wavelength solution. So no two telescopes, no two instruments have found a consistent way of describing those transformations. If there were such a thing, then I think it is completely generalizable. The big thing that will make it hard is understanding the wavelength-dependent PSF. I mean, the trace and wavelength solutions, those are things that the average astronomer can fudge along the way if they need. But understanding the 3D PSF is going to be, I think, probably the tall pole for that. Currently, we're assuming that STPSF knows how to solve that problem. If that is not true, then I don't know what to tell you. So that's what would maybe limit its applicability to, say, HST, right? We don't have as a well-established 3D PSF.
Apologies if this is a simple question, but I may be missing something. You showed us doing like IFU type extraction from slitless spectroscopy, but I'm not sure I understand why you wouldn't just use an IFU to get those kinds of observations instead.
Yeah. I mean, it's that we're just covering volumes and numbers that are beyond what is capable. Originally, Roman had an IFU for that exact purpose. That was what it was there for. But it got chucked overboard to save money. And instead, it was argued that we can do it we argued that we can do it in software. And so that's where we are. Yeah, if you had a sizable telescope in the north and the south to do it, I think that is the right solution. It provides nothing more than that. Although I will say the thing that I think should be really impressive about this is that an IFU would require you would get higher signal to noise, higher spectral resolution, higher, better everything. What you would lose is survey volume. You would only get to do the galaxy in question. Whereas these techniques allow you to turn all of this, unleash it on the entire Roman survey. So anything that's bright enough that you think you could get a signal out, you can unleash this pipeline on and get an IFU-like data cube at the lower resolution, maybe at a lower signal to noise, but you would be able to get that for any source in the field, all 1,800 or 18 square degrees. But I didn't talk about the wide area survey where there's another sort of 2,000 square degrees of these kinds of data.
One more question.
You go, Jay. You go. I know it. Yeah.
Actually, like, I mean, if you observe the same field from a rotated point of view, like, does it help with the convolution?
No, that's the point. That's what we are doing. So I should have said, we're observing the same field of view every 5 days. So what we'll do to the spacecraft to first order rotates 1 degree per day, right? It's 365 days, 360 degrees. So sort of 1 day it clocks over at 1 degree, and we'll come back to the same spot on the sky every 5 days. And we will do that for a year and a half. So you will get something like, several hundred unique roll angles. And, to first order, you're triangulating back where all of those photons came from.
Cool. All right, let's thank Russell and please join us again in a couple of weeks.
For James Talk.